The bravest hearts are often the ones standing completely alone. Rain crashed through the towering pine trees with relentless force, turning the narrow forest path into ribbons of dark mud as thunder rolled across the mountains surrounding the moon-packed territory. The storm had driven every sensible traveler indoors long before sunset, leaving only the restless wind to weave through ancient branches and the distant howl of wolves echoing beneath the heavy clouds. Grace Carter pulled her worn gray cloak tighter around her shoulders as she hurried along the familiar trail toward her small wooden cottage, a basket of freshly gathered medicinal herbs pressed carefully against her side. Every step splashed through cold puddles, yet she barely noticed the discomfort. She had learned years ago that loneliness often made the quiet sounds of nature feel more welcoming than the voices waiting inside the village. The other Omegas rarely greeted her anymore. Some believed she was too soft for pack life. Others quietly whispered that kindness was simply another form of weakness. Grace had stopped trying to change their minds. She simply continued living the way her late grandmother had taught her, believing that compassion should never depend upon whether someone deserved it. Another distant cry drifted through the storm. This one was different. Softer. Shorter. Fragile enough that the wind almost carried it away before Grace recognized it. She stopped walking immediately. Rainwater trickled from loose strands of chestnut hair as she listened again. There it was. A faint whimper somewhere beyond the trees. Her heartbeat quickened. Every child in the pack grew up learning the oldest rule of the forest. Never approach an abandoned wolf. The pack abandoned only those it believed could not survive, and anyone interfering with that decision risked being treated as an enemy of tradition. Grace looked toward the path leading safely home, then back toward the dark woods where the quiet cry had nearly disappeared beneath the rain. She closed her eyes for only a moment before changing direction. Wet branches brushed against her cloak as she carefully followed the sound deeper into the forest. Moss-covered stones disappeared beneath rushing water, and tangled roots reached across the ground like sleeping giants. Finally, beneath the twisted roots of a fallen oak tree, she found the source of the desperate cry. A tiny wolf cub lay curled against the damp earth, its pale silver fur soaked by rain, its small body trembling from exhaustion rather than fear. It looked impossibly young, hardly old enough to survive alone beneath such a storm. Grace slowly knelt, careful not to frighten it. The cub opened bright silver eyes that seemed strangely calm despite its condition. It did not growl. It did not try to crawl away. Instead, it looked directly at her as though silently asking the question no living creature should ever have to ask. Will anyone stay? Grace's throat tightened. She gently removed her cloak and wrapped the tiny animal inside its warm folds before lifting it carefully into her arms. The cub rested its head against her shoulder with complete trust, its breathing growing steadier almost immediately. She knew exactly what this choice could cost her. If anyone discovered she had ignored the pack's judgment, she would be accused of defying sacred law. Yet as another burst of thunder shook the forest, Grace looked down at the small life depending entirely upon her and quietly whispered, "You are not alone anymore." Hidden beyond the curtain of rain, unseen by Grace or the trembling cub resting safely against her heart, a pair of watchful silver eyes observed everything from the shadows between the towering pines before silently disappearing into the darkness. Grace pushed open the weathered wooden door of her tiny cottage with one careful shoulder while keeping the silver wolf cub safely wrapped inside her rain-soaked cloak. Warm air carrying the comforting scent of dried lavender, pine needles, and freshly brewed herbal tea greeted them as the heavy door closed against the roaring storm outside. Rain continued striking the roof in steady waves, but inside the modest home everything felt quiet, protected, and still. Grace gently placed the trembling cub onto a thick wool blanket beside the stone fireplace before kneeling beside it. She added another log to the fire until golden flames slowly filled the room with welcome warmth. The tiny animal remained curled tightly into itself, its pale silver fur damp and matted from the long night beneath the storm. Grace noticed that although the cub appeared exhausted, it never showed fear toward her. Instead, its bright silver eyes quietly followed every movement she made, almost as though it already understood that she meant no harm. She disappeared briefly into the small kitchen corner and returned carrying a wooden bowl filled with warm water, clean linen cloths, and several bundles of carefully dried medicinal herbs gathered earlier that afternoon. Her grandmother had taught her the healing properties of every flower, root, and leaf growing throughout the forest, long before Grace understood how often that knowledge would comfort others instead of herself. She carefully dipped the cloth into warm water and gently cleaned the rain and mud from the cub's soft fur. Every movement remained slow and patient, allowing the frightened little creature to trust her at its own pace. The cub flinched only once before relaxing completely beneath her gentle touch. Grace smiled softly. "You are braver than you know," she whispered while mixing crushed herbs into a soothing paste. She spread the natural remedy across several small scratches hidden beneath the silver fur before wrapping the areas with narrow strips of clean linen. The cub quietly rested its small head against her wrist, its breathing becoming steadier with every passing minute. Grace could not remember the last time another living creature had accepted her kindness so completely without hesitation. After warming a little goat's milk over the fire, she poured it into a shallow wooden dish and carefully placed it beside the blanket. At first the cub merely watched the bowl with sleepy eyes. Then, encouraged by Grace's reassuring smile, it slowly drank until the dish was empty. A tiny sigh escaped its mouth before it settled comfortably beside the fire once again. Grace laughed quietly, the sound so rare within the lonely cottage that it surprised even her. She covered the cub with an extra wool blanket before sitting beside the hearth herself, stretching tired hands toward the dancing flames. Outside, thunder gradually faded into distant echoes while moonlight occasionally broke through the thinning clouds. Grace looked toward the window, wondering whether anyone had seen her leave the forest carrying the abandoned cub. She understood the danger of what she had done. If the pack discovered the animal inside her home, they would not ask why she had helped it. They would simply judge the choice itself. Yet as she looked back toward the sleeping cub, every doubt quietly disappeared. No tradition that demanded abandoning a helpless life had ever felt right inside her heart. Across the room, the cub suddenly stirred from its sleep and slowly walked toward her. Without making a sound, it rested its tiny head against her knee before closing its silver eyes once more, as though choosing her as its safest place in the world. Grace gently stroked the soft fur behind its ears while smiling through tired eyes. Hidden beyond the frosted window, unnoticed beneath the shelter of towering pine trees, the same mysterious silver eyes from the forest silently watched the warm light glowing inside the little cottage before disappearing once again into the quiet darkness, carrying with them a growing certainty that the young Omega had just changed far more than one small life. Morning arrived quietly, washing the forest with pale golden light that filtered through the towering pines surrounding Grace's little cottage. The storm had finally passed, leaving tiny drops of rain clinging to every leaf like scattered crystals. Inside, the warmth of the stone fireplace still lingered, carrying the comforting scent of cedar wood and dried herbs. Grace opened the cottage window just enough to let the fresh mountain air drift inside before checking on the silver wolf cub sleeping peacefully beneath its wool blanket. The difference from the previous night was remarkable. Its breathing had become steady, its silver fur now clean and soft, and the quiet exhaustion in its bright eyes had been replaced by cautious curiosity. Grace smiled with genuine relief as the cub slowly stretched before carefully climbing to its feet. It took a few uncertain steps across the wooden floor, then looked back toward her as though asking permission to continue. She laughed softly and nodded. "Go ahead. You have already been brave enough to survive." The tiny wolf cautiously explored every corner of the cottage, sniffing baskets filled with herbs, inspecting the old rocking chair beside the fireplace, and finally stopping beside a wooden shelf where several hand-carved animal figures rested. Grace watched with quiet amusement as the cub gently nudged one of the little wooden wolves with its nose before sitting beside it, almost as if recognizing something familiar. She prepared a simple breakfast of warm oatmeal for herself and fresh goat's milk for her unexpected guest. The cub eagerly finished every drop before lifting its head with bright, grateful eyes. Grace reached down and gently stroked the soft fur behind its ears. "Someone must be missing you," she whispered. "I hope they have not stopped looking." Even as she spoke those words, a small part of her wondered whether anyone truly was searching. The oldest stories of the pack claimed abandoned wolves were never reclaimed. She refused to believe that such a young life had been left behind willingly, yet she had no evidence to prove otherwise. Later that morning, Grace carried a basket of herbs toward the nearby village market, carefully asking the cub to remain inside until she returned. To her surprise, it obediently curled beside the fireplace as though it understood every word. Before leaving, she gently closed the wooden shutters, hoping no curious neighbor would notice anything unusual. The village square slowly filled with familiar faces as merchants arranged vegetables, fresh bread, and woven blankets beneath colorful canvas awnings. Grace greeted everyone with the same quiet kindness she always offered, although few returned more than a polite nod. While purchasing fresh linen from an elderly shopkeeper, she overheard several pack members speaking in worried voices nearby. A silver wolf cub disappeared during last night's storm, one hunter said. The warrior searched until dawn and found nothing. Another lowered his voice. The elders declared that anyone hiding it would be punished for interfering with pack law. Grace felt her heart tighten, but she kept her expression calm while carefully placing the folded linen into her basket. She thanked the shopkeeper, purchased additional medicinal herbs, and quietly made her way home before anyone could notice the concern hidden behind her gentle smile. As she approached her cottage, she found the little wolf cub waiting just inside the doorway exactly where she had left it. The moment it saw her, its tail wagged happily before it trotted across the room and rested against her legs with complete trust. Grace knelt beside the tiny animal, suddenly realizing that every passing hour made it harder to imagine sending it away. Hidden among the towering trees beyond the cottage, a cloaked figure silently watched the reunion unfold. His striking silver eyes reflected neither suspicion nor anger, only quiet admiration for the young Omega whose kindness remained unchanged even after learning that helping the helpless might soon cost her everything. The peaceful rhythm of the afternoon disappeared beneath the sudden sound of pounding footsteps outside Grace's cottage. The silver wolf cub instantly lifted its head from the blanket beside the fireplace, its ears standing alert while its bright silver eyes fixed upon the wooden door. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. She quietly placed the basket of herbs onto the table and stepped toward the small window overlooking the narrow forest path. Through the glass she saw 6 pack warriors approaching with deliberate purpose, their dark cloaks moving with the cool mountain breeze. Behind them walked Elder Rowan, the oldest member of the Moon Pack Council, his weathered face calm but unmistakably stern. Several curious villagers followed at a respectful distance, whispering quietly among themselves as they gathered near the cottage. Grace closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. She knew this moment would eventually come. She simply had not expected it so soon. A firm knock echoed through the small house. Before another could follow, Grace opened the door herself. The afternoon sunlight illuminated the clearing while the breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh rain. Elder Rowan regarded her with measured silence before speaking. Grace Carter, we have reason to believe an abandoned wolf cub is inside this home. His voice carried neither anger nor kindness, only the weight of ancient tradition. Grace remained calm. There is a young wolf here, she answered honestly. It needed help. Quiet murmurs spread through the watching villagers. One woman lowered her eyes while another shook her head in disbelief. A young warrior stepped forward. The pack declared that cub abandoned. It does not belong here. Grace looked toward the open doorway where the tiny silver cub had quietly appeared behind her. It did not hide. Instead, it remained close enough that its shoulder gently touched the hem of her dress. She glanced down and offered the smallest reassuring smile before facing the council again. No living creature should be left to die when someone is able to help. Another warrior frowned. You place your feelings above pack law. Grace answered without raising her voice. I chose compassion. If that is against the law, then perhaps compassion deserves to be heard before judgment. Several people exchanged uneasy glances. No one expected the quiet Omega to answer with such peaceful confidence. Elder Rowan slowly stepped closer. His eyes settled briefly upon the small wolf before returning to Grace. You know our customs, he said. The council does not make such decisions lightly. Grace nodded gently. I know. But I also know that this cub trusted the first hand willing to help instead of turning away. The little wolf slowly walked forward until it stood directly beside her. When one of the warriors took another cautious step, the cub instinctively leaned against Grace rather than retreating into the cottage. The simple gesture caused another wave of whispers among the gathered villagers. Grace lowered one hand and gently rested it upon the cub's head. She did not attempt to hide it. She did not step aside. She simply remained where she stood. If someone must answer for this choice, she said quietly, let it be me. The cub has done nothing except survive. The clearing fell into complete silence. Even the birds resting among the nearby pine branches seemed to pause. Elder Rowan studied the young Omega for a long moment before drawing a slow breath. At sunrise tomorrow, he declared, the council will gather before the entire pack. If that wolf remains under your protection when the first light reaches the valley, your actions will be judged publicly. Without another word, he turned and began walking back toward the village. One by one the warriors followed. The watching crowd slowly dispersed, though many looked back at Grace with expressions no longer filled entirely with ridicule but touched by uncertainty. Grace remained standing in the doorway until the last footsteps faded into the forest. Only then did she kneel beside the little silver wolf. The cub gently pressed its head against her shoulder while she whispered softly, whatever tomorrow brings, you will not face it alone. Hidden beyond the tree line, the mysterious cloaked observer watched the entire exchange in thoughtful silence, and for the first time, a quiet smile appeared across his face before he disappeared once again into the deep forest shadows. Evening settled gently over the moon-packed territory as the last traces of golden sunlight disappeared behind the distant mountain ridges, leaving the forest wrapped in quiet shades of blue and silver. Grace closed the cottage door after bringing in another armful of firewood, then paused for a moment beside the window where she could see the first stars beginning to appear above the towering pines. Less than 12 hours remained before sunrise. Less than 12 hours before the entire pack would gather to judge the decision she would never regret. She looked toward the silver wolf cub resting peacefully beside the fireplace. It had recovered with remarkable speed. The tiny creature no longer trembled from exhaustion, and its once weary eyes now sparkled with quiet curiosity every time it looked at her. Grace carried a small wooden bowl filled with warm goat's milk across the room and placed it gently on the floor. The cub happily drank every drop before lifting its head with a contented sigh that made her smile despite the uncertainty waiting beyond dawn. You certainly feel stronger today, she whispered while gently brushing her fingers through the soft silver fur along its neck. The cub responded by nudging her hand before playfully walking toward the opened shelf where the little carved wooden wolf still rested. It carefully touched the carving with its nose again, then looked back at Grace as though inviting her to notice the strange habit. She laughed quietly. You truly like that little wolf, do not you? The cub wagged its tail once before carrying the small wooden carving across the room with surprising care and placing it beside the fireplace. Grace could not explain why such a simple gesture warmed her heart so deeply. The lonely cottage suddenly felt more alive than it had in years. Later, while she prepared fresh herbal tea, a soft scratching sound came from the front door. Grace opened it cautiously and found Mrs. Eleanor, the elderly widow from the neighboring cottage, standing outside with a basket covered by a clean linen cloth. The older woman offered a gentle smile. I baked too much bread today, she said quietly. I thought perhaps you might enjoy some. Grace accepted the basket with sincere gratitude. Before leaving, Mrs. Eleanor glanced toward the little silver cub sleeping beside the fire. Instead of showing fear or disapproval, she simply smiled sadly. Kindness often asks a higher price than comfort, she said softly. But I have lived long enough to know that it is still worth choosing. Grace felt unexpected tears gathering behind her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. After the elderly woman disappeared down the narrow forest path, Grace carefully closed the door once again. Outside, darkness continued spreading across the valley while distant wolf howls echoed between the mountains. Inside, the fire crackled peacefully, filling the cottage with warmth that contrasted sharply against the uncertainty beyond its walls. The silver cub suddenly lifted its head and turned toward the window. Its bright silver eyes focused on something moving among the trees. Grace followed its gaze but saw only moonlight filtering through the branches. Unknown to her, a tall cloaked figure stood hidden just beyond the edge of the clearing, watching the quiet cottage with calm patience. His striking silver eyes rested first upon the little wolf, then upon the young Omega whose gentle compassion had never faltered despite the judgment waiting at sunrise. For a long silent moment he remained perfectly still before quietly placing one hand over the silver wolf crest hidden beneath his dark traveling cloak. A faint smile crossed his face as though every choice Grace had made confirmed something he already believed. Inside the cottage, unaware of the unseen witness beyond the trees, Grace gently covered the sleeping cub with another warm blanket before sitting beside the fire. She watched the dancing flames while the little wolf rested peacefully against her feet, and although tomorrow promised uncertainty, she realized her heart felt strangely calm because some decisions were simply too important to abandon, no matter what dawn might bring. The night deepened until the forest seemed suspended between silence and moonlight. Inside the little cottage, only the gentle crackling of the stone fireplace and the steady rhythm of the silver wolf cub's breathing disturbed the stillness. Grace remained awake beside the fire, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of herbal tea that had long since begun to cool. Sleep refused to come. Every passing minute carried her one step closer to sunrise and the judgment waiting beyond her door. Yet when she looked toward the tiny wolf peacefully sleeping with its head resting upon the folded wool blanket she had prepared, regret never entered her heart. She quietly smiled instead. If tomorrow demanded an explanation for compassion, she would gladly offer one. The moon climbed higher above the forest, casting pale silver light through the cottage window and across the wooden floor. The cub slowly opened its bright silver eyes before standing and padding softly across the room. Grace expected it to curl beside the fireplace once again. Instead, it approached the front door. Its ears stood alert, listening carefully to sounds too distant for human hearing. Grace set her cup aside and knelt beside the little animal. "What is it?" she whispered. The cub gently nudged her hand, then looked toward the door once more. There was no fear in its expression, only quiet determination. Curious, Grace carefully opened the door. Cool mountain air drifted inside carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth. The forest beyond remained peaceful beneath the moon, with mist weaving gently between ancient trees. The cub stepped outside, paused for a moment, then looked back at Grace as though asking her to trust it one more time. She followed slowly across the small clearing. Together they stood beneath the stars while moonlight bathed the quiet valley in soft silver. The little wolf lifted its head toward the distant mountains and released a gentle call that echoed faintly through the sleeping forest. It was not loud. It was not desperate. It sounded almost like a greeting carried upon the night breeze. Grace listened as the sound faded into the distance. For several long moments nothing answered. Then, far beyond the trees, another call drifted back through the mountains. It was calm, deep, and reassuring. The cub's eyes immediately brightened. It wagged its tail once before turning happily toward Grace and resting against her legs. She gently stroked the soft silver fur, unable to explain why tears suddenly filled her eyes. "Someone really is looking for you," she whispered with quiet relief. "I knew you had not been forgotten." The cub looked up at her with complete trust, then quietly returned inside the cottage as though satisfied that its message had reached whoever needed to hear it. Grace closed the door behind them and added another piece of cedar wood to the fire. She quietly folded another blanket beside the sleeping cub before settling into the rocking chair near the hearth. Outside, the stars slowly began giving way to the faintest hint of light along the eastern horizon. Time continued moving toward the morning she could not avoid. Deep within the forest, hidden beyond the reach of ordinary eyes, a group of cloaked riders silently emerged between the towering pines. Their horses moved without haste beneath banners bearing a silver wolf crest that shimmered beneath the fading moonlight. At their head rode a tall man whose calm silver eyes remained fixed upon the warm glow of Grace's distant cottage. He quietly raised one hand, signaling the riders to stop. "We wait until sunrise," he said softly. No one questioned the order. The forest itself seemed to honor the silence. Inside the cottage, unaware that destiny had already reached the edge of her quiet life, Grace gently closed her eyes for the first time that night while the little silver wolf slept peacefully beside the fire, completely certain that when dawn finally arrived, it would not face the coming judgment alone. The first rays of sunrise slowly climbed above the eastern mountains, bathing the moon-packed territory in soft golden light that seemed almost too peaceful for the judgment waiting ahead. A cool morning breeze carried the scent of pine, fresh earth, and dew-covered wildflowers through the valley as villagers quietly gathered near the ancient stone circle where the pack held its most solemn assemblies. Grace walked the familiar forest path alone, her simple gray cloak wrapped neatly around her shoulders. At her side trotted the little silver wolf cub, healthy now, its bright eyes filled with calm trust instead of fear. Neither hurried. Every step they took echoed with quiet certainty rather than hesitation. By the time they reached the clearing, nearly the entire pack had assembled. Warriors stood in disciplined rows beneath tall cedar trees. Elders formed a silent circle around the weathered stone platform at the center of the gathering. Families whispered softly among themselves while curious children peeked from behind their parents, wondering why an Omega had become the focus of the morning council. Grace gently rested one hand upon the cub's head before stepping forward. Elder Rowan regarded her with thoughtful eyes. "Grace Carter," he began calmly, "you were given until sunrise to decide whether you would surrender the abandoned wolf." Grace lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "I made my decision the night I found him." A low murmur spread through the assembled crowd. One young warrior folded his arms. "Then you knowingly chose to stand against pack law?" Grace answered without raising her voice. "I chose not to abandon a helpless life." The words settled over the clearing like the morning mist itself. Several elders exchanged measured glances, while others remained expressionless. The silver cub quietly leaned against Grace's leg, refusing to leave her side even as dozens of unfamiliar eyes watched every movement it made. Elder Rowan slowly stepped forward. "Then, according to our tradition, the council will determine your place within this pack." Grace accepted the words with peaceful composure. She did not plead. She did not defend herself further. She simply stood beside the little wolf exactly as she had promised. Suddenly the cub lifted its head. Its ears stood alert as it looked beyond the gathering toward the distant forest road. Grace noticed the change immediately. Before anyone could ask what had captured its attention, the little wolf gently brushed against her hand one final time before quietly slipping away from her side. "Wait," Grace whispered softly, instinctively taking one step after it. The cub paused only long enough to look back into her eyes. There was no fear there. Only reassurance. Then it turned and began running toward the tree line with surprising speed. A ripple of confusion spread through the crowd. "It is escaping," someone whispered. Another shook his head. "It always belonged to the wild." Grace remained motionless. Although every instinct urged her to follow, something deep inside her heart told her to trust the little creature one last time. She watched until its silver fur disappeared between the towering pines. Silence settled heavily across the clearing. Several warriors exchanged satisfied looks, believing the matter had resolved itself. A few villagers quietly lowered their eyes, convinced Grace had sacrificed everything only to be left alone. Grace felt an ache inside her chest, yet regret never found a place beside it. If the cub had reached safety, then every difficult choice had been worthwhile. Elder Rowan slowly drew breath to address the assembly once more. Before a single word could leave his lips, the distant sound of horses echoed through the valley. Every head turned toward the forest road. Sunlight flashed across polished silver armor emerging between the ancient pines. One rider became three. Three became a long procession. Tall banners bearing the royal silver wolf crest rose above the morning mist, gently moving with the breeze as an escort unlike anything the moon pack had ever witnessed rode steadily toward the clearing, while Grace stood perfectly still, unaware that the small life she had protected was now leading destiny directly back to her. The royal procession advanced slowly through the morning mist until every silver banner shimmered beneath the rising sun, transforming the quiet forest clearing into a place of solemn wonder. No one in the moon pack spoke. Warriors instinctively straightened their posture while elders exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing the ancient silver wolf crest carried only by the royal bloodline. Grace remained standing where she was, her hands folded quietly before her, still searching the tree line where the little silver cub had disappeared only moments earlier. She could not understand why the royal escort had arrived, nor why every rider seemed to be following the exact path the tiny wolf had taken into the forest. The lead horse came to a graceful stop several yards from the stone circle. Behind it, two perfect rows of royal guards dismounted in complete silence before lowering polished silver spears in a gesture of ceremonial respect rather than intimidation. Their discipline alone distinguished them from ordinary warriors. Every movement reflected years of careful training and quiet honor. The captain of the royal guard stepped forward first, his deep blue cloak moving gently with the morning breeze. He surveyed the assembled pack before turning toward Elder Rowan. "Remain where you stand," he said calmly. "His Majesty wishes this gathering to continue exactly as it began." The unexpected instruction left the clearing wrapped in deeper silence. Elder Rowan nodded respectfully without asking questions. Even he understood that the arrival of the royal court placed every local custom beneath a higher authority. Before anyone could speak again, a familiar flash of silver appeared between the towering pines. The little wolf cub emerged from the forest at a joyful run, its bright eyes filled with excitement. Instead of returning immediately to Grace, it crossed the clearing toward the royal escort with complete confidence. Several villagers watched in astonishment as the tiny creature ran directly between the rows of royal guards. None of them attempted to stop it. None even looked surprised. They simply smiled warmly as the cub passed beside them. Grace felt both relief and confusion fill her heart at once. The cub had found the family she hoped still searched for it. Yet something about the way the royal guards greeted the tiny wolf suggested this reunion was far more significant than she could understand. The little silver wolf finally reached the magnificent black horse standing at the front of the procession. A tall figure dressed in a dark traveling cloak remained seated calmly in the saddle, his face partially hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. The cub immediately rose onto its hind legs, placing both front paws gently against the rider's boot while wagging its tail with unmistakable affection. The cloaked man leaned down and gently rested one gloved hand upon the little wolf's head. The cub closed its eyes peacefully beneath the familiar touch before looking back across the clearing toward Grace. The silent exchange lasted only a heartbeat, yet gratitude seemed to shine within the tiny animal's silver eyes. The mysterious rider slowly lifted his gaze toward the young Omega standing beside the ancient stone circle. Even from a distance, Grace sensed an extraordinary calm within those unseen eyes beneath the hood. He studied her not with suspicion, but with quiet respect that felt strangely familiar. Around the clearing, whispers spread through the assembled pack. No one recognized the traveler, yet everyone understood that the tiny wolf clearly belonged to him. The captain of the royal guard stepped forward once more, placed a closed fist respectfully across his heart, and lowered his head toward the cloaked rider. "Your Majesty," he announced clearly enough for every soul in the valley to hear, "the heir has returned safely because of the courage of the woman standing before you." At that single sentence, every breath seemed to leave the clearing at once, while Grace stood frozen beneath the golden light of sunrise, only beginning to realize that the helpless wolf she had chosen to protect had carried a destiny far greater than anyone had ever imagined. The clearing remained completely silent after the captain's announcement, as though even the morning breeze had paused beneath the weight of those astonishing words. Grace stood motionless beside the ancient stone circle, unable to look away from the cloaked rider whose calm presence commanded effortless respect. Around her, the members of the Moon Pack exchanged bewildered glances, their earlier certainty replaced by growing disbelief. Only moments before, they had gathered to judge an Omega for protecting an abandoned wolf cub. Now they were witnessing the arrival of the royal court, and nothing about the morning unfolded as anyone had expected. The little silver wolf happily circled the black horse before returning to the rider's side, occasionally glancing toward Grace with unmistakable affection. The cloaked man slowly dismounted with measured grace. His polished black boots touched the dew-covered grass without haste, and every royal guard instinctively lowered their heads as he stepped forward. Grace noticed that none of them watched him with fear. They looked upon him with complete trust. The mysterious figure gently removed the hood from his traveling cloak. Dark hair caught the warm light of sunrise, while striking silver eyes reflected the quiet strength of someone who had carried responsibility for many years. His expression remained composed, neither distant nor severe, only thoughtful. Grace immediately recognized those eyes. They were the same silver eyes that had silently watched her from the forest shadows each time she had chosen kindness over caution. A quiet realization settled inside her heart. He had known about the little wolf from the very beginning. The little cub trotted happily toward Grace once more before returning to stand beside the tall man, moving between them as though it belonged equally with both. A faint smile appeared across the stranger's face. He remembered exactly where kindness found him, he said softly. His voice carried calm warmth instead of royal formality. Grace lowered her eyes respectfully. I only did what I hoped someone would do for any helpless creature. The man's thoughtful expression deepened. Most people say that, he replied. Very few are willing to risk everything to prove it. Around the clearing, no one dared interrupt their conversation. Elder Rowan quietly removed the ceremonial staff from before him and bowed his head, waiting for the royal guest to speak first. The stranger finally turned toward the assembled pack. 3 nights ago, he said clearly, the young heir became separated from his escort during the storm. Every royal search party followed the mountain trails, believing fear would drive him toward open ground. He looked back at Grace before continuing. Instead, he found someone whose first instinct was not to ask who he belonged to, but whether he was cold, hungry, and alone. The little wolf gently leaned against Grace's leg again, drawing quiet smiles even from several royal guards. The stranger rested one hand upon the cub's head. This young heir has always judged character well, he said with quiet pride. He trusted the right person. Several members of the Moon Pack slowly lowered their eyes, remembering every harsh word spoken against Grace during the previous day. The young warriors who had demanded the cub's surrender stood silently, unable to defend their earlier certainty. Grace herself felt only relief that the little wolf truly had a family waiting for him. She never expected anything in return. The tall man studied her for another thoughtful moment before taking one slow step closer. Sunlight illuminated the silver wolf crest fastened across his dark cloak, revealing the ancient symbol worn only by one bloodline throughout the kingdom. Every royal guard immediately placed a closed fist across the center of the chest and bowed deeply in perfect unison. Their captain lifted his voice once more so the entire valley could hear. Please welcome His Majesty, King Ethan Blackwood, Alpha King of the Northern Realms. A wave of astonishment swept across the clearing, while Grace stood beneath the morning sun with widened eyes, realizing that the quiet stranger who had watched her choose compassion again and again was not merely the protector of the royal heir, but the Alpha King himself. Morning sunlight spread across the ancient stone circle, illuminating every face gathered within the clearing while complete silence settled over the Moon Pack. Grace still struggled to believe what she had just heard. The quiet stranger who had watched her from the forest shadows was not only the protector of the little silver wolf. He was King Ethan Blackwood, the Alpha King whose name was spoken with respect across every pack throughout the Northern Realms. She instinctively lowered her head. Your Majesty, she said softly, I did not know. Ethan answered with the same calm warmth that had followed every unseen glance from the forest. That is precisely why I remained unseen. Grace slowly lifted her eyes, confused by his reply. Ethan looked toward the little silver heir, who happily walked between them before sitting beside Grace once again. The tiny wolf leaned comfortably against her leg, completely at peace. Ethan smiled faintly. Titles often change the way people behave, he said. I wished to discover who you were before you knew who I was. The words settled gently across the clearing. Every elder, warrior, and villager listened without daring to interrupt. Ethan turned toward the assembled pack, his silver eyes moving calmly across every familiar face. For 3 days I watched from the forest, he continued. I saw Grace carry the young heir through a storm when everyone else had abandoned hope. I watched her warm him beside her fire before she warmed herself. I watched her share her food, her home, and her kindness without asking for reward. I watched her stand before your council fully prepared to accept punishment rather than surrender a helpless life. His voice never rose above a calm conversation, yet every sentence carried unmistakable authority. Several warriors quietly lowered their eyes. Elder Rowan removed his ceremonial hood and bowed his head with sincere respect. Ethan continued. Not once did she ask whether the cub belonged to a royal bloodline. Not once did she wonder whether helping him would improve her own life. She acted because compassion guided her before fear could. Grace felt her cheeks warm beneath the morning light. She had never imagined that every quiet choice inside her lonely cottage had been witnessed. She looked toward the little wolf, who responded by gently placing one tiny paw upon the top of her boot. Ethan noticed the gesture and smiled again. The young heir trusted you immediately, he said. He has always possessed remarkable instincts. He recognized your heart long before anyone else did. Around the clearing, the whispers that once carried judgment slowly transformed into thoughtful silence. Mothers quietly drew their children closer. Young warriors exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who had openly criticized Grace no longer seemed able to defend their earlier certainty. Ethan slowly walked toward Grace until only a single respectful step separated them. His posture reflected neither royal distance nor overwhelming authority. Instead, he stood before her as one person speaking honestly to another. Grace Carter, he said gently, throughout these past days you believed you were protecting one abandoned cub. In truth, you preserved the future of an entire royal bloodline. Grace looked at him in complete astonishment. I only wanted him to live, she answered quietly. Ethan nodded. Exactly. The simple reply carried more admiration than any public praise. The Alpha King slowly extended his hand toward her, not as a command but as an invitation offered with complete respect before the entire pack. Every person in the clearing instinctively held their breath. The little silver heir looked up happily between them, as though already knowing what would happen next, while the first golden rays of the rising sun bathed the valley in warm light and every watching heart sensed that the Alpha King was about to make a declaration no one would ever forget. Grace looked at the Alpha King's outstretched hand without moving. Around them, the entire moon pack stood frozen beneath the golden light of sunrise, waiting to see whether the young Omega would dare accept a gesture no one in the valley had ever witnessed before. Her heart beat so quickly that the quiet sounds of the forest almost disappeared beneath it. Only the little silver heir seemed completely at ease. The cub sat happily between them, looking first at Grace and then at King Ethan before gently wagging its tail, as though convinced that the two people it trusted most had finally found one another. Grace slowly raised her eyes to meet Ethan's calm silver gaze. There was no command within it. No pride. No expectation that she would obey simply because he wore a crown. Instead, she saw the same quiet respect she had sensed every time those unseen eyes had watched her from the forest. With careful hesitation, she placed her hand into his. Ethan closed his fingers gently around hers, making certain the gesture felt like reassurance rather than authority. A quiet breath seemed to leave the entire clearing at once. Several villagers exchanged astonished glances while the younger warriors stood speechless. No one had ever seen an Alpha King offer such open respect to an Omega before an entire pack. Ethan kept his eyes on Grace as though no one else existed. You believed you stood alone, he said softly. You never did. Grace felt unexpected emotion rise within her chest. Why did you not reveal yourself sooner? She asked quietly. Ethan smiled with thoughtful warmth. Because kindness shown to a king proves very little. Kindness shown to someone believed to have no value reveals everything. The words settled over the gathering with unmistakable clarity. Elder Rowan slowly stepped forward before lowering his head toward Grace. We judged your choice before we understood your heart, he admitted. For that, this council carries its own lesson today. Grace looked at the elderly leader with gentle eyes. There was no satisfaction in proving anyone wrong. Only relief that the little wolf had been reunited with those who loved him. One by one, the warriors who had stood outside her cottage the previous afternoon quietly lowered their heads as well. The young warrior who had accused her of placing feelings above pack law finally found the courage to speak. "I believed strength meant following rules without question," he said. "Today I learned that true strength sometimes begins with compassion." Grace answered with the same quiet grace that had guided every choice she made. "Then today belongs to all of us." Her words surprised many more deeply than anger ever could have. Ethan watched her with unmistakable admiration. Even after public judgment, she chose healing instead of revenge. Even after being vindicated, she refused to humiliate those who had once humiliated her. The little silver air happily circled around both of them before resting against Grace once again, drawing warm smiles from the royal guards who had remained solemn until now. Ethan gently looked down at the playful cub before lifting his gaze back to Grace. "He chose you long before I did," he said with a quiet smile. "I simply trusted his judgment." Soft laughter rippled gently through the clearing, easing the tension that had weighed upon every heart since sunrise. The morning breeze carried the scent of pine and wildflowers across the valley while golden light illuminated the ancient stone circle where judgment had quietly transformed into understanding. Ethan continued holding Grace's hand with calm respect before turning toward the assembled pack. His expression remained composed, yet there was unmistakable purpose in his silver eyes. Every royal guard instinctively straightened. Every elder waited in complete silence. Grace sensed that the Alpha King had one final declaration prepared, and as the first full rays of sunlight rose above the mountains, she realized that the greatest turning point of her life had not yet been spoken. King Ethan slowly released a quiet breath before turning toward the assembled moon pack, yet he never let go of Grace's hand. The gentle morning sunlight continued spreading across the ancient stone circle, warming the dew-covered grass until the entire valley seemed to glow beneath the new day. No one moved. Even the birds resting among the towering pine branches remained strangely quiet, as though nature itself wished to witness what would happen next. The little silver heir happily sat beside Grace, occasionally brushing against the hem of her cloak before looking up at Ethan with complete trust. The Alpha King's silver eyes calmly swept across the gathering. Warriors, elders, villagers, and royal guards all waited in respectful silence. There was no fear within the clearing now. Only anticipation. Ethan spoke with the same measured calm that had marked every word since his arrival. "Strength has never been measured by the power to command," he said. "It has always been measured by the willingness to protect those who cannot protect themselves." His voice carried naturally through the valley without ever becoming loud. 3 days ago, many believed this young Omega had broken your laws. Today you have all witnessed that she upheld something even older than tradition. She honored compassion. Elder Rowan quietly lowered his head once again. Several members of the council followed his example. One by one, the villagers who had doubted Grace found themselves unable to meet her eyes. Ethan gently turned toward Grace. She looked back at him with quiet uncertainty, still struggling to understand why someone as powerful as the Alpha King continued speaking about her with such sincere admiration. "Grace Carter," he said softly, "when the future of the royal bloodline depended upon the kindness of a stranger, fate chose you." Grace shook her head almost imperceptibly. "I am only an Omega," she answered honestly. Ethan's expression warmed with the faintest smile. "No," he replied. "You are a woman whose heart remained unchanged when fear, loneliness, and judgment surrounded you. That is far greater than any title." Those simple words settled deeply within every heart listening. The little silver heir happily stepped between them before gently placing one tiny paw upon Grace's boot, as though adding his own quiet agreement. Soft laughter spread through the royal guards, followed by warm smiles from several villagers. The atmosphere that had begun with accusation now carried unexpected hope. Ethan slowly lifted Grace's hand so everyone gathered could clearly see the quiet gesture. He did not raise it like a prize. He held it with unmistakable respect. Before every witness standing here, he declared calmly, "I will not allow this woman's courage to remain hidden any longer." Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. She searched his face, wondering what he intended to say next, but his silver eyes remained steady and reassuring. "The future of every kingdom depends upon people whose compassion cannot be purchased and whose character cannot be frightened into silence," Ethan continued. "Such people deserve to be honored, protected, and trusted." He paused briefly before speaking the words that would forever change the morning. "From this day forward, Grace Carter stands under my personal protection, and before this entire pack, I openly claim her as the woman I have chosen." A quiet wave of astonishment moved across the clearing. No one spoke. No one questioned him. The royal guards immediately placed closed fists over their hearts. Elder Rowan slowly knelt, followed by the council elders. One after another, the warriors and villagers respectfully lowered their heads, not because they had been commanded, but because the truth standing before them could no longer be denied. Grace remained speechless, her eyes shimmering with emotion as the little silver heir joyfully circled around both of them beneath the golden light of sunrise, while the valley that had gathered to judge her instead became the place where her life was transformed forever. Golden sunlight continued spreading across the valley until every blade of dew-covered grass shimmered beneath the warmth of the new morning, transforming the ancient stone circle from a place of judgment into a place of quiet hope. Grace stood beside King Ethan Blackwood with her hand still gently resting in his, hardly able to believe that only hours earlier she had expected to lose everything she held dear. The little silver heir happily ran playful circles around them before stopping beside Grace once again, gently pressing against her leg with complete trust. She smiled down at the tiny wolf, remembering the cold, rain-soaked night when she had first found him alone beneath the fallen oak tree. At that moment she had possessed nothing except a warm cloak, a few healing herbs, and the simple belief that no helpless life should ever be abandoned. She had never imagined that one quiet decision would change the course of her future forever. King Ethan looked toward the assembled pack, where every elder, warrior, villager, and royal guard remained respectfully silent. The atmosphere had changed completely. The whispers that once questioned Grace's worth had disappeared, replaced by thoughtful reflection. Ethan slowly released Grace's hand only to step beside her rather than ahead of her, allowing everyone present to see that he regarded her as someone worthy of standing beside him instead of behind him. "This morning," he said calmly, "you believed you had gathered to judge one Omega. Instead, you have all been given the opportunity to remember what truly holds a pack together." His silver eyes moved gently across the familiar faces before continuing. "Traditions deserve respect, but compassion gives traditions their purpose. Without kindness, even the oldest laws become empty." Elder Rowan quietly nodded, deeply moved by the wisdom carried within those simple words. One after another, members of the Moon Pack stepped forward, not because anyone instructed them to do so, but because gratitude replaced pride within their hearts. The young warrior who had once demanded the wolf cub be surrendered bowed respectfully before Grace. "Thank you," he said honestly. "You protected what all of us failed to recognize." Grace answered with the same gentle humility that had guided every choice she had made. The little one only needed someone willing to stay. Her quiet reply touched the gathered villagers more deeply than any speech could have. Mrs. Eleanor smiled warmly through grateful tears while several children cautiously approached the little silver heir. The tiny wolf happily greeted them with playful curiosity, reminding everyone that innocence had never been the enemy. Fear had been. Ethan watched Grace for a long moment before speaking softly enough that only she could clearly hear him. "The kingdom needs people exactly like you." Grace looked toward the distant mountains where sunlight now illuminated every forest path she had walked alone for so many years. "I only know how to choose kindness," she answered. Ethan smiled. "That is why I chose you." The words settled gently into her heart. There was no grand ceremony. No elaborate display. Only quiet truth spoken beneath an open sky. The royal escort slowly prepared for the journey home while the little silver heir trotted happily between Grace and Ethan as though it had always belonged beside them both. When they finally began walking together toward the waiting horses, the entire Moon Pack respectfully stepped aside to create a clear path. No one looked at Grace with pity anymore. No one questioned her place. They saw only the woman whose compassion had united two worlds without ever lifting a weapon or demanding recognition. As the valley slowly disappeared behind them, Grace glanced back one final time. The little cottage, the forest, and the ancient stone circle remained exactly where they had always been. Yet everything felt different because the greatest transformation had never happened around her. It had happened within every heart willing to believe that true strength begins with kindness, and from that sunrise forward the story of the Omega who sheltered a helpless wolf cub became a legend passed from one generation to the next, reminding every pack that compassion freely given will always leave a legacy far greater than fear.